Hello and welcome to Contra. My guest this episode is Stephanie Arnold. Stephanie and I talk about homelessness and the opioid epidemic in general, as well as some issues that are specific to the Victoria region. Stephanie has a master's degree in political science from McMaster. Yes, that is a McMaster master's. And she's working on her second master's, not McMaster's, in the social dimensions of health at the University of Victoria. Her thesis is on the intersection of culture and policy and how the outcomes affect illegal substance users. Hey, Stephanie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm excited to have you on because as soon as I moved to Victoria, one of the first things I saw walking to work was Tent City set up there. So there was like I've never heard so much ado about 20 people, which I think kind of has a lot to do with what we're talking about, addictions and that cycle of homelessness and addiction. Mm-hmm. Have you ever worked with those people or heard about those issues?
Yes. I moved to Victoria last September, and that I think that's when it started to pick up. I know it happened a little bit also in August, but one of the women who were on my thesis committee was really involved with Tent City and kind of getting the message out there as to why Tent City has happened. So while I don't work directly with that population, I've done a little bit of organizing with some people who do work more directly with them. She's a nurse, but she works at the university as a professor. So she does a lot more kind of frontline work and engagement.
Okay.
Yeah.
As kind of like an advocate?
Yes, 100%. Like she practices a lot of, I guess there's a bit of a tension in the academic community when you're working with individuals who are facing such adverse life circumstances. It's a little ethically comparable to just do research without actually being present in the fight for like their liberation and better treatment of these individuals. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So what we did was, it was called I think a letter bomb, where we had all written like a little opinion pieces for the Time Colonists and just various different, news sources in Victoria. And the point of that was to explain why tent cities pop up. So the one that I wrote, we looked at, why shelters are ineffective, right? I've heard a lot of people say things, people who have been in shelters say that they're almost as bad as prisons when it comes to violence that individuals face. The sleeping conditions, often it's just a mat on the floor. So while shelters do exist, sometimes they don't give that sense of hominess that's super important to an individual's well-being. And sometimes you can get that if you have a tent, especially because how shelters are usually set up is that you have to leave in the morning, right? So then you take all of your stuff, you pack it up and you leave. But when you have a tent and you also get to choose the people who are in the tent city with you, I think it's a lot more equivalent to the closest thing to a home that someone can get when they are homeless.
Well, I can totally see that. And I mean, I think that's why it's so polarizing, because I look at, you look at a shelter and not very many people look at it, like walk by a homeless shelter or one of these like halfway houses and think like, dang, I really wish I was riding it out there.
Mm-hmm, totally.
I mean, and I don't walk by Tent City and wish I was there, but there's an aspect of that, of simplicity, and people associate camping with good times, especially in Victoria where there's a lot of outdoorsy people. Mm-hmm. So there's that a lot of resentment, I think, towards people that are taking up a public use space and making it their home, because I think people feel like it's like freeloading and they get that resentment towards those people.
Totally. And that is, from at least my research and standpoint, a lot to do with misunderstandings of how people become homeless. It's not a moralistic or like a laziness attribute in somebody. There's various structures that contribute, like social structures that contribute to people not having a place to stay. So even today, I was actually talking to a social work colleague, and we were saying just how absolutely like privileged people are to grow up with books in their homes. And if you don't have a strong background, and there are quite high rates of queer homeless people because of that, like, if you don't have that familiar Black background that'll kind of support you in that support network, you tend to, I straight up lost my train of thought.
You were talking about how the increased incidence of the queer population in homelessness.
Oh, yeah. So essentially, people do still face discrimination by their parents if they are queer. And that happens a lot for younger people who end up, you need to leave because it's a violent and unsafe environment for you. But yeah, so a lot of broader things that people don't really, people who aren't queer aren't going to think of these things, right? But if they come from loving homes, they're not going to consider what it would be like to have your parents reject you based on your identity and who you want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all these things, it's a spectrum, right? Like there's certain things in society and things in families which would make somebody much more likely to go down that route. And then different people have different resiliencies from genetics or family background that they would be more resilient to a situation like that, because there's lots of people who are kind of excommunicated from their family that have done really well, but those are like risk factors, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, it also plays into the intersection of your identity, of where you were socially located. So I mean, a Black gay woman is going to have a lot harder of a time getting back on her feet than, let's say, a white gay man, just because of they're facing other forms of discrimination, racism, misogyny, homophobia, as opposed to, let's say, just homophobia.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I've heard of that. I've definitely heard of that train of thought before. So how do you think people who are homeless are treated in society? Like, how do you think in general we view them, and how do you think we, how should that change, or how can we make that better?
I think a language to understand more systemic factors, so understanding intersecting pieces of someone's identity. Your comment, the first question about how are they treated in society, how are they viewed? I mean, I definitely feel like there is that idea that they are freeloaders, that they just want things that they're not entitled to because of the idea of productivity and needing to work for a living. I personally am somebody who don't think that. I think even if you don't have a single dollar to your name, you shouldn't have to be homeless. You should be able to have, even if you don't have the intent to work, whether it's able-bodied or not. I mean, recently I saw something about they were going to have housing for artists. And someone made the comment about so basically this is just for homeless people, right? And it's ideas of productivity are, I think, very narrow nowadays, because you can look at somebody who is being productive in their daily life and isn't a freeloader, because I think being an artist is a career of merit, but also homeless people's regular activities of canning or sex work or even selling drugs are really strategic kind of maneuvers in their daily life to survive on the street. And I think we have this kind of idea what a productive person looks like, and those aren't taken into account, and thus they're kind of tossed off as freeloaders. But if you see a homeless person collecting cans, they've been doing it all night. It's hard work. It takes a lot of time. And being able to hold a job is, quite frankly, a privilege. I mean, especially in today's society, when menial labor jobs are incredibly low wage, and it's been, commented on that it's really difficult to have even 3 or 4 of these low income jobs and still be able to support yourself or your family.
Yeah. I think where I probably differ a little bit is when you're talking about productivity, if somebody is unable to produce, then in terms of add value to the market, and collective society, then that's where I see like charity come in. And if that's through government or through private, totally understandable. But I do struggle if somebody's unable to, if they're able to, yet unwilling. And like, I definitely see being an artist as a, career of merit as well. Like for sure, I have art in my house, but I think if people aren't buying your art and you're not, like, that's what the free market is for in some regards. Like, if you're not, what you're producing, people aren't buying, the subjective evaluation of it is low enough such that maybe, maybe you should keep doing it, but maybe you need to find some other way to bring, sustenance to yourself, right? Especially if you're physically able to. That's where I guess I would struggle with
totally
that a bit. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people think that way. It's just really difficult for me to be in line with that type of thought when I see banks and automobile companies, the subjective evaluation is that people are not buying their commodities, and yet they are still bailed out. So this idea of these large corporations getting bailouts, but we can't, and I'm not going to call it a bailout for an individual, but can't support an individual, even if, they're an artist and no one's buying their work.
Yeah.
Is a little too conflicting for me.
Well, I definitely agree with part of that. Like, I think bailouts are generally a bad idea, right? Like, you're propping up a failing company. I would say that they exist because people have bought their products and have felt that there's value to their products, at least in the past, whether it's a bank or auto company. So they have at some point provided value. I think that we need to let these like large pillars of industry fail to make space for people who can do it more efficiently. Like, maybe the electric car would have been accelerated if some of these large automakers failed, or maybe we'd have more efficient Japanese cars or whatever it could be. Like, maybe smaller startups would have taken the place of these, these giants that were bailed out. And similarly to with banking in the US. But I think it's a bailout. That being said, it's like a one-time measure. And I think a lot of Canadian social programs, from my understanding of it, they're kind of built around almost like the bailout structure. It's that, like, we're going to give somebody the tools and resources to allow them to become productive as much as possible. Like, even if somebody's severely physically handicapped, generally they want to enable that person to contribute in some way, and that person will find meaning in their life through that contribution, rather than just continually supporting them. Because that would be even worse in the industry if there was a car company that was so atrocious they not only needed a bailout, but they needed like consistent support for the remainder of the existence of that auto company.
I understand that in terms of talking about automobile companies, I just don't think that individuals who need consistent support should be abandoned. But this also speaks to, I think, like a larger I would say, difference in our perspective, whereas, like you've mentioned, things like charity, and that means that the care for these, or like at least how you perceive the care and support for these individuals, is an act of charity as opposed to what I would say is like a basic human right. So one of the principle of harm reduction, and I consider myself a harm reduction researcher because I'm more interested in how ideas of drug use shape public policy as opposed to studying substance use itself. Obviously, those greatly overlap, so I do study both. That being said, though, the principle is to meet an individual where they were at and kind of stay with them as long as it takes to get them wherever they need to go. And it doesn't exactly look at getting someone off drugs per se. I mean, I've obviously studied harm reduction within a drug use setting. There's other forms of harm reduction, like seatbelts are harm reduction, but for the sake of this conversation, I think it's important to, if you expect somebody to change like how they're being or how they're operating within society immediately, it comes across as like this very coercive, and people can pick up on your dissatisfaction with how they are as opposed to being present. And another, again, reason that I think it's important to continue to do this is because I don't see things like homelessness and drug use as an individual problem. I conceptualize it as the result of personally, like, more income inequality in the past 40 years than before. It's people who have like a lack of meaning, I would say, in their life. This is not everybody, but I think a large portion. And I also think it's a bit of a myth that there's, people out there who can totally work and just don't do it, like they're completely capable, but they're just like sitting around. Like, humans do enjoy labor. There's just kind of this disconnect from our meaning that we ascribe to labor, as opposed to like, I would say what would be necessary to keep somebody engaged in their work.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's like where kind of like maybe our fundamental ideologies, differ. It's just like the lens in which we view it from, in that I think that like the more conservative way to look at things is like from what's possible financially, and that keeping in mind that we're in an open system where our economic power as a country and as a nation or as a city can be challenged by outside forces. Whereas then the opposite is that we have a certain amount of wealth and excess right now, and we can, on the more liberal side, and that can be redistributed more fairly, which is true. Like both are true. I think like the existential threat is always like what can come from the outside and what imbalances can we impose upon ourselves from within that will destabilize the system that we have. And that's like, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think that's just kind of like where our viewpoints might conflict a little bit, but I don't want to spend all day like talking about, liberal versus conservative ideas. But I wanted to hear more about the policy of like, cause in my mind, this is where I imagine we'll both completely agree. I think all drugs should be legal. I can't understand why we'd make meth illegal. Like, people do meth, it obviously causes them harm in most cases, whether it's the drug or the side effects of that lifestyle. Like, why do we want to make that person a criminal on top of everything? I can understand why, if we decide to make meth illegal, then you have a meth dealer who's taking advantage of children and all these, terrible things that I suppose meth dealers probably do, or at least some of them.
I don't know any meth dealers that take advantage of children, but
no, I mean like selling to underage kids and stuff like that. I don't know too many of them either, but you know what I mean. I can see. I don't see the point of making drugs illegal. I don't, and that to me is like, as far as that's like a libertarian idea as well as a very liberal idea. That's where we'd maybe have some like really common ground. Yeah,
totally. And even like, so when you start saying like, you're using meth and that causes you harm, it's really not meth that is harmful. Mm-hmm. Meth is actually, I've never done methamphetamine. I've done amphetamine derivatives like dexedrine and Vyvanse, and I personally absolutely love them. I don't have a prescription for them, and I buy them off whoever has a prescription for them. I'm totally fine going on record saying this. It's great for studying. It's great during my depressive episodes when it's hard for me to do things. Amphetamines have a very I want to say popular history of being prescribed to housewives. Domestic labor is exhausting and a lot. So when women were complaining about, fatigue, as well as I think it was also used for hysteria, but they would be prescribed an amphetamine derivative. Soldiers in World War II were given amphetamines.
Yeah, wasn't it like Japanese fighter pilots? Wasn't that
it was. I'm pretty sure it was every country that was just like giving their soldiers this. It's an extra edge. Who else?
Yeah, actually, I saw a clip on YouTube of Hitler. Apparently, he was tweaking on meth at some sports game.
Loved meth. Yeah. Yes, from what I've heard, Hitler used a lot of meth. I don't know if exactly meth, but it was amphetamines. But what were you?
Well, I was asking you about like I think before the podcast, you had mentioned something about like the history of drugs being illegal and some of the like the policy that's been created around that, which has resulted in a lot of people being alienated because not only do they have, addiction issues, but now they're a criminal on top of that, and they can't maybe seek the resources that would be available to you if you were just an alcoholic.
Yeah. And then also what like that does ties into what we were talking about with amphetamine, but kind of criminality and deviance is really circumstantial because obviously if it was totally okay to prescribe people, I mean, also people get amphetamine derivatives today if you have ADHD, right? So that isn't in itself criminal. But when people, use meth for other reasons, a very popular reason is when people become homeless for whatever reason had gotten there in the first place. They use meth to stay up at night because if you're sleeping on the streets, you get harassed by police officers. So it's important to be awake and vigilant. You also get robbed, but it's important to be awake and vigilant. So, you can avoid that. You don't want to. You want to minimize your interactions with the cops as much as possible. But the origins of drug law, I'm not exactly sure when it comes to amphetamines, but most, like every drug law that I can think of is just because of racism, straight up racism. There was a guy named Harry Anslinger in the U.S. So Prohibition has only been around for about 100 years. But he was convinced that people of color, especially African Americans, were using drugs more than white people. I'm not entirely sure if he even believed that himself, or he just wanted to create a really strong association between people of color and drugs, and then outlaw drugs in order to harm communities of color. But either way,
you think he just had racist motives for harming?
Oh, he straight up said it. Yeah, it's like on record that Johann Hari wrote a book called Chasing the Scream. And I think like it's just this wonderful journalistic account of the origin of drug laws. There's also a book about Canadian drug laws called More Harm Than Good that I like because it's like a third of the size of Chasing the Scream. Okay. But yeah, essentially it was called cannabis. He changed the name. I'm not sure if it was him, if it was the Bureau of Narcotics that he had created, to marijuana because it sounded more Mexican and he wanted to associate cannabis with Mexicans. So what he did was he basically was a master of fake news, and he came up with all these like newspaper articles about, Mexicans in particular eating eating cannabis leaves or smoking cannabis and then going crazy and killing people and all these like horrific stories, which we all know now. If you smoke weed, you don't have the urge to get off the couch, let alone commit mass murder. But then when it got really interesting was when there was a white kid who was known to smoke weed and had killed his entire family. He was also known to have schizophrenia, which I think probably played a bigger role in that incident. But then the rhetoric kind of started to center around the harms that these drugs can do to white people, right? So both heroin and cannabis were banned in the United States for fear of the social harms of interracial mixing. So people dating people of other races. And obviously whatever the States does is modular for every single other nation. And Harry Anslinger himself has been referred to as a bureaucratic genius, meaning that he was able to, and I often think about this when I read this part about how can someone manipulate the government so much to get away with, changing all of these laws, changing people's like ideas, stoking these fears. And then I think immediately about Donald Trump, because, even though his race-based panic has no merit, so many people believe it, right? So like these things are totally possible and it's still mind-blowing to this day. But essentially that is how he got to influence the UN and change drug laws internationally. In Canada, there's similar origins. So like the actual
But even in like non-white countries, like China, for example, and Singapore, they have extremely strict drug laws.
Totally. And I think that just speaks to the reach of the ideas that drugs were harmful, because you have to remember, like before this guy came along, you could buy like opium in the pharmacy, and and again, you could be prescribed amphetamines, and people happily drank like coca leaves.
Yeah, I heard what I heard is that like I don't know the names and dates associated as well as you do, but that people would regularly use cannabis like in, you know, the Midwest, and they were aware of marijuana from the propaganda, but they didn't actually know that the thing where they were lobbying to be illegal was also the thing they were enjoying recreationally because of the name change.
Wow, I didn't even know that. But yeah, so I mean, it speaks to, I think, the reach that he had on the world, but also at the same time, it's not just the reach about like anti-drugs, it's also how people associate them with criminals. So Nixon had the Southern strategy where his advisor came out years later being like, we can't outlaw people to be Black or anti-war, but we can associate these groups with drugs and then make drugs illegal. Mm-hmm. So it's more drugs being weaponized to punish like anti-war and colored communities. So
yeah, so that's like, yeah, and I've heard a lot of those similar ideas. And so now that I mean, maybe you disagree with it, but I think our societies are generally not racist these days. Like, and I mean, not to say there's not racist people, there certainly are many of those, but like nobody in parliament is going to stand up and, you know, back up marijuana law by using, you know, racism. They're never going to say, well, white people and Black people are going to, you know, end up spending more time together if we make cannabis legal.
You would be surprised.
Well, I would be really surprised if somebody in parliament stands up and overtly talks about racism in that manner.
Did you see Maxime Bernier on the debates?
No, and I didn't watch them. What did he say?
He was just quite overtly racist, blaming a lot of problems on immigrants. But no, you point to a very...
But that's also, if you say immigrants, that said, is a little bit different. I'm not advocating...
You know what kind of immigrants he's talking about. They're not people from Europe.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think there's a cultural difference from various countries. So I do think it's different. And I'm not saying it's good to be prejudiced overtly against non-white immigrants. I think that's a bad thing. But I think it is different to say like Black people and immigrants, because one is a cultural difference and one is a physical difference.
We can go into a whole other podcast about why I don't think, you know, there is much of a difference between the groups. I can understand like where you're coming from, obviously, because, you know, they're coming in from a different country. So you see them as somewhat out of an other, but to focus more back on the origins of drug laws and the problems associated with race-based groups, to use an immigrant example, actually, it was the reason that opium was banned in Canada was because Chinese immigrants were smoking, were they smoking opium? Yeah, they were smoking opium in opium dens, and which, you know, was completely fine. No one was going like off the rails. There was no real social harm other than apparently it lures in, you can't see this, but like finger quotation marks, it lures in white women to want to sleep with them. Yeah. And again, you couldn't have that. So that was one of the bans, or like one of the reasons for banning opium. However, white people were still allowed to access it.
What decade was that? That's like
oh my God, I want to say the 30s.
Yeah. That sounds like the least sexy place in the world, an opium den in the 30s.
Yeah, I don't think anyone was going in there. I mean, possibly for sex work. But I think we can agree that these policies aren't exactly favorable towards sex workers either, and not the type of women they were interested in protecting, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, and I guess to bring it back to like current day, I mean, now that all these things are illegal, and people who use them are, you know, de facto criminals. How do you think that shapes their options for getting out of that, you know, spiral?
Well, I mean, people are definitely afraid to seek treatment when they're labeled a criminal, right? Mm-hmm. So treating these individuals like a criminal when I think it's actually like drug addiction, like problematic, consistent substance use, I think is a very creative way to deal with immediate problems within your life that there are little support for. Mm-hmm. But again, that behavior is criminalized within certain contexts, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like certainly drugs are an effective, at least temporary coping mechanism. Like we are, people, if you have anxiety or you have, problems paying attention, you're prescribed amphetamines. But if you don't have, you kind of use that, the privilege of having a family doctor and having that social support network, and you look to like self-medicate, then of course you become a criminal right away. So if I was addicted to meth or whatever, heroin, any of these drugs, and I just went to the hospital and said, listen, I'm addicted to this, I'm worried I'm going to overdose, what would happen to me?
You would usually get, I want to say, pamphlets for, they're often abstinence geared treatment. Ideally, someone would try to get you to a doctor that would give you methadone or Suboxone. These have their own problems. These are like opioid replacement therapies. Like, I don't think you get high from them, but you use them to keep off withdrawal. Okay. Unfortunately, they don't really work for everybody. A lot of people don't experience like zero withdrawal on them. They still withdrawals very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I suppose, of course, whatever symptom that made them take those drugs in the first place has not subsided.
No,
like whatever
and you're
pain
not
or
fixing
trauma they're dealing with
the structural issues of like getting someone into a withdrawal management program isn't giving them a home. So you can come out sober, but you don't have a home. Although, unfortunately, being sober is a prerequisite for a lot of housing programs, which is very difficult. Mainly also because housing programs don't give you the best housing and not something you really want to be sober for. But that being said, again, ideally, they would give you clean needles if you were to continue to use. But I think where the problem lies is that people, or even healthcare practitioners, aren't giving you both of these options. So they're not going to, point you in the direction of what we would call abstinence-based recovery, as well as harm reduction, in fear of harm reduction efforts like syringe exchanges, or giving you a pamphlet to the local safe consumption site. They fear that kind of enables that behavior, that like maybe you've overdosed and you've had this moment where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. If you give you needles, they think that you're just going to keep doing it. I mean, chances are you probably already had that idea about how harmful this is for you if you wanted to stop begin with.
Most people aren't stupid. They can look at themselves
and yet they're
in the mirror.
Treated very stupidly. But so yeah, I think there definitely is still more of a prominent approach to getting people immediately off of drugs, which again is not super helpful when you don't solve the more distal reasons for why people are on drugs in the first place.
And who's like, you think it's, whose responsibility do you think it is to solve that problem of their, like if, Bob is homeless and is addicted to drugs, like where do you think the onus lies on getting Bob off drugs and getting him into a home and getting him financial support and enough that he can pursue some meaningful hobbies and interests and the kind of things that like fulfill a human being, maybe have a family and all that?
I would definitely place that responsibility on the state, mainly because I feel like a lot of addiction is I feel like it's well documented that a lot of substance use disorder is caused by a lack of meaning from increased social inequality. So, I mean, let's look at an example. Let's say Bob was Indigenous, right? I mean, there's obviously a huge presence and overrepresentation of Indigenous people who use drugs because we see that colonialism and that severance from their culture and the land and their family so deeply impacts them and is a huge form of intergenerational trauma. I think that's a more obvious example where I would say clearly that is the government's responsibility to provide various tools. I still think it's the government's responsibility in every case, because I think what we're really missing is a comprehensive drug education. I mean, just say no does not work. I'm not sure what kind of drug education you received as a kid, but my message was very clear. No. Just don't do drugs, which we know doesn't work. So again, there's like, this state education that isn't giving people the proper tools to deal with what they're going to experience later on in life. I also think that there's tons of social resources, like welfare resources, that have been increasingly cut back in the past 40 years that are contributing to this lack of meaning. And there's a really awesome study. Have you heard of the rat park study?
No.
So essentially, this psychologist at UBC had 2 rat cages, and one was, just kind of barren and had cocaine water and regular water in it, and he put the rats in there.
I did hear about this one.
Oh,
yeah. This is good. Keep going, though. Yeah.
And, they loved the cocaine water, and they drank it to a point of death where they ignored other things. But then he had the rat park, which was a very fun enclosement, and they had like balls and other rats and all sorts of like fun little things that rats loved. And they didn't go to the cocaine water nearly as frequently. And I think when it comes to humans, those, colorful balls and tunnels and other rats are the different social structures that a culture of like late neoliberalism has like really chipped away at. So I would say public funding for like events and all these other things that when conservatives say that they're saving taxpayers money, what they're really saying is we're getting rid of these different, social, educational, healthcare efforts. I mean, is it less spending? Yes, sure. It ends up usually going out into corporate lobbyist pockets. But again, I think like I can see a connection between how we've scaled back.
Usually the corporate lobbyists are actually the ones paying the politicians to do what they want. But
well, you know what I mean? People who get kickbacks for deregulation of or like increased privatization of what is at some point social services.
I mean, yeah, I think politics are a bit more nuanced than that. I definitely agree that there are like forces that want taxes to be decreased, certainly. Yeah, I have troubles. I don't see kind of like the Darth Vader and the Death Star and kind of like this evil ring of collusionists conspiring to, keep people down and decrease taxes as much as possible. I think there's like a, yin and yang. I think there's like some conservative ideas that need to be understood and abided by in society. And there's also some liberal ideas. And I think like the best way to make decisions is kind of like how we do now, having an open, I don't think the discourse is as open as it has been in the past. But, if everything was run by liberals, the society would be torn down to its fundamental structures. Everybody would lose everything, and we'd redistribute it completely evenly, which would basically make everything grind to a halt. And if it was run by conservatives, everybody that didn't have a certain bare minimum would be completely dispossessed and just forgotten about. So I think both of these are like, a dystopian future, right? But I think like having that blend of the two as we do, and having different opinions kind of battled out in the court of ideas is, beneficial. I definitely see how what you're talking about though, having these, like I haven't seen the statistics as far as like cuts to these social programs, but yeah, I certainly, it's always like hard to trust nostalgia, but it seems like when I hear people talk about the past, there was like a lot more community events and engagements and stuff like that. It sounds like it could be true. Do you have like, I don't know, I don't want to ask for statistics offhand. That's not fair, but like, is that something that's like a documented fact that we've decreased funding to those areas? I
would say yes, just because since the late 70s, early 80s, with the rise of neoliberalism, a key component of that...
I actually don't know what neoliberalism is.
Oh, okay. So basically it's like a political economic strategy where you deregulate the markets as much as possible. And you usually, at least in Reagan and Thatcher's time, and well, still now, they kind of like cut back on social programs. So I'll give you an example, like Ontario Works, during like it was like 95, so a little bit after this, but when it starts to culturally really take hold, they really cut down on what they would give people on Ontario welfare. And that was in order to liberate them on their self-entrepreneurial spirit. So it's,
Yeah.
yes, right. So they give you the bare minimum so you can go out there and, do the work. But again, that obviously doesn't work for many people who, disability in Ontario is absolutely nothing.
Okay.
And that is for people who are not able-bodied, let alone people who are, able-bodied, but still need resources because, trickle-down economics does not work. It's been well documented that wealth gets hoarded at the top. Minimum wage has not been increased to the level of like inflation, or not taken into, like inflation isn't taken into account when we do these minimum wage increases. So there's just like increased stratification, and that's kind of like a core consequence of neoliberal ideology of just opening up the free markets and having government's hands less in what would have been kind of more of a taken for granted social welfare.
Yeah. This is my fault. I keep pulling us into these kind of like left-right things, which I don't mean to keep doing because we're just going to keep disagreeing.
It's so hard though, because I think like I'm somebody who conceives as addiction as a result of neoliberal capitalism. Like I don't look at it as a brain disease. I don't look at it as a moralistic failing. I think it's a result from a society that is lacking meaning and increasingly individually competitive, and also forcing people to work jobs to make other people rich that they derive no real value for, but they have to do it because they have to survive somehow.
Because like for me, and like I'm not as educated in these things, I think what you're saying is correct. However, I just see that it's like a contributing factor. All those things that you mentioned. I think like I'm a firm believer in personal responsibility for myself, and as well as I think, if people want to have a meaningful life, personal responsibility is like absolutely a necessity. Like if you read any story, like, whether it's Disney, from the Bible, the Quran, like any of these stories where they, the older generation attempts to model good behavior to tell their children, it always is a character that takes personal responsibility. There's never a character that doesn't do anything and just, floats through life and is just pushed down by the pressures and succumbs to those pressures and then has a great ending. Like it's always about personal responsibility. And I think that's kind of like an ancient human wisdom that's been passed down through, whatever, in whatever like system we have at the time for talking to people about whether it's a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist. Like it's about taking hold of what you're given and doing the best with that, the hand that you're dealt, to use that kind of cliche.
That is a very like entrepreneurial kind of, I would say like neoliberal, also conservative position, right? And
I'm also not saying that that's 100% the case. Like by the hand that you're dealt, it acknowledges that some people have a handful of dog shit cards, like, and it's really tough to play that hand. Like, and I acknowledge that my hand was pretty good. It's not the best, far from the worst, very, very far from the worst. I think what I heard is if you make over $32,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of the population of the world.
Oh yeah.
So I am like in the top 1%. So I'm, great hand of cards I was dealt. But to say that somebody that's in a lower level, it's 100% the system, 100% this, that's where I just disagree, because, and I'm not saying what percentage, I'm not saying it's 10%, but to deny that there's any personal culpability, that's where I do have a bit of trouble, because it's such an absolute statement. I can't believe it to be true, That's totally fair. And I don't want to come off as if I don't think anyone should ever have any personal culpability. I mean, that obviously definitely plays a factor, but I also think it's a neoliberal myth that there's these people out here that don't want to do anything, right? I mean, people are given shitty cards, and if you are, like I volunteer at various social service organizations, so I get to interact with people who have problematic substance use or are you're
homeless,
taking a lot of personal responsibility. Like that volunteering is an amazing service to your community. Most people do not do that. So like, I certainly commend you for doing that. And that's amazing.
Well, I think I am also incredibly privileged. So, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to not have to work every waking hour, and that I can spend that time volunteering with people. That being said, though, I see these individuals as incredibly resourceful. I mean, I think if you know like a lot of these people, I don't think, like, I feel like they blame themselves a lot, because they do buy into this idea of almost excessive personal responsibility.
Yeah.
When they're almost like blind to the broader structures that contribute to these.
And so do you think it would be more helpful to them if they felt that it was society that was culpable for their position and not their own actions?
I can't answer that without being very speculative, but I do think the idea of like pulling up your bootstrap kind of thing is a little bit of a fairy tale, because given where you're socially located, pulling up your bootstrap probably won't get you very far.
But it gets you farther. It has a higher percentage of getting you somewhere than not doing it.
I mean, yes and no. Pulling up a bootstrap is a literal metaphor, so I can't exactly say that it's going to get you farther or not. I do think, but the idea behind that narrative is what I would call a consequence of cultural neoliberalism, that anybody can do it, and if you can't do it, it's your fault. Don't look at us because we have nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very obtuse viewpoint. I certainly don't believe in that. I think, people come from a variety of backgrounds, and, if I look at somebody that's on the street, I don't think that, they should have just as much right. And I think that's actually why, you can judge somebody. I feel like I can judge somebody harshly that is from a well-to-do family and has a good job and all these things that they probably worked very hard for, but still come from privilege as well. And they treat wait staff like garbage.
I think we could all agree those people suck. They absolutely suck.
And that's kind of like, even if they are educated and they believe in intersectionality and all these things, if they haven't embraced those principles, if they treat somebody, at Tim Hortons like garbage, because they just don't acknowledge that person might have worked their ass off to get that job at Tim Hortons, and they might be compromising everything they possibly can to work that job to feed their family or do whatever it takes. Like, that person might not actually be loafing. Maybe they are. Maybe they're just hanging out, smoking weed and picking up 3 shifts and living in their parents' basement. But, you can't assume that just by...
And even if they are, I still think they're worth inherent respect and dignity. I mean, I think agree. A broader problem is conflating someone's worth with how much they contribute to society under this very capitalist viewpoint of what contribution looks like. Mm-hmm. So that person could be an artist, but working at Tim Hortons too, but either way, you don't have to be an artist to be worthy of respect if you work at Tim Hortons. Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly systemic issues, but that is actually one thing I like about our society. I think we're actually pretty good, and I shouldn't say good like with respect to everything, but good with respect to other societies, that, people are treated fairly equally. Like, if a CEO of a Fortune 500 company was in a Tim Hortons and punched out a homeless guy, like, that guy would go to jail. Like, he'd get arrested, and, he would have expensive lawyers, and he would have all these privileges that come with his wealth to defend himself. But if that was caught on a cell phone, like, that guy's in shit. If that happens in India or Africa or name 100 other countries, that guy might just walk right out of there. He might be able to kill that guy and walk right out of there. So, I think it's often easy to like hate our culture because things could be more fair. Like, that guy maybe shouldn't have access to those legal counsels. Maybe the homeless guy should have access to that, $200,000 a year lawyer, and they don't, and that's not fair. But relative to what exists, and we should strive for better. But that's one thing I feel like we need to kind of consider as well, is that, like, we actually have things pretty good. And I think, like, I kind of wanted to circle back to our point about, like, who has the responsibility for these people, and like which you answered, which you said society. And then, like, where do we need to, where can we draw the limits? Because there's 2 places I see potentially that we'd say there'd be limits on what society can do for these individuals. One is just like the economic reality. So there has to be a limit. Say if we're in Africa and we're in the Zambezi, and somebody's, to use like maybe like a neoliberal word would be like, if they're loafing, like if they're not giving their share, we can't actually support that person. We only have enough grain for the people that are bringing water, and we just can't afford to take care of that person. If they're doing art and nobody's buying their art, we just can't. Sorry. And then here, we can, but it still takes away from other programs. Maybe it takes away from healthcare. It takes away from, there's a limited tax base.
Totally.
But
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I do want to go back to the example of like a CEO punching out a homeless man and getting arrested. I mean, yes, rightfully. That being said, though, homeless people are arrested for just existing in Tim Hortons, right? So I don't think it's that like cut and dry when it comes to like equality. I have seen a homeless person literally have the cops called on them just for they were trying to drink water to the side of a house, and this woman like 4 houses down was watching him for like 20 minutes as I was on this like patio having a coffee, and they were filling up their water and drinking it and filling up the water and drinking it, and then she called the police to like tell him to leave. Yeah. And I mean, he's standing technically on the sidewalk still. So I don't think the treatment is exactly fair. But that being said, I'm not an economist, but I do realize that we just bought a $4.5 billion pipeline. And if we can afford a pipeline, I feel like we can probably afford multiple types of social support for these individuals.
Yeah. And that's actually where I totally agree with you. Because like the pipeline, and I don't know much about that, but in my understanding of it, the pipeline's an investment. We're putting down some money now to recoup more money later, right? And I think that with a lot of these social programs, they're investments, right? Like the reason as a society we, help children get, better fed, right? Like we have these like school lunch programs or whatever, so that these people can get educated, do better, and then come back and contribute to the society. And I think like from a federal level, that's actually like a fair way to look at things. Now, that's a pretty cruel, if you're a parent, that's a really cruel way of looking at things. Like if you're only feeding your child so that they can make money and take care of you when you're old, but I think as you expand to a certain point of abstraction, you kind of have to start looking at the numbers, because the numbers become the limiting factor.
I'm not good at math, so.
Okay. Yeah.
But no, I do think it's definitely cruel to look at, to consider people as investments that you're just banking on returning. I don't think that values the inherent worth of an individual. But if that's how I have to sell it to people.
Yeah. I think you do, because you're selling a product, right? At the end of the day, people want to see their tax dollars invested wisely. And they don't want a program that has an infinite amount of money and very little gain, even if the gain isn't economic, if it's social. And that's kind of like where I'm looking to kind of find out your views on, because you know so much more about these programs and that whatnot than I do, is like where are the most efficient ones? Like if somebody was going to donate money, like where would the programs like have their most economic input? Because that's something that I think it's like economics, like it's not an unlimited resource. I know theoretically we could say like, oh, we can just tax people more and bring that in. And, that's true, but it's probably not going to happen. Like if you look at our tax revenue right now as like X, theoretically, if we tax the hell out of, billionaires and companies, maybe we could reach it to 2X, but it's still only 2X. It's not infinity. Like, so maybe we have double the tax base to do these programs, but it's not infinite. So it's still, in my mind, there has to be some measure of like financial balance in that. And that's kind of like, I guess what I'm asking is like, first of all, where do you see the limits? And then where do you see the most effective programs, if that makes sense?
Okay. Yeah, totally. I'm personally somebody who's just like, screw the whole economy. It's a made up thing that, we came up with, that we can change it at any point in time if we want to.
That's true at all.
It's a human invention, and it has tangible impacts, of course, and where you can best direct the money to make those tangible impacts. I would say supporting grassroots organizations. Like I personally don't donate to like, I don't know, Free the Children, because there are people who are local and in that community who know that community the best and know how to serve their needs. But that goes back to the belief that, or like a belief of medical humanitarianism, which is, people are charity cases as opposed to deserving of healthcare as an intrinsic right of being alive. Yeah.
And I guess like, again, we have so many things we disagree on that it's hard to like, I feel like I'm wasting, an opportunity here a little bit because you have so much more experience in this field, but I am inserting my opinion so many times on top of yours. So I hope that's okay.
No, it's super important for me to learn like how people, I mean, at one point I thought like this and things shifted, but you become so disconnect with these like hegemonic ideas of how people should be and how money should be spent that it's important for me to like hear this again because it's almost like foreign to me, even though I encounter it every single day. I also live in a little bit of an echo chamber of people
with academia.
Yeah, who are like-minded, and I read criticism of this stuff, and it's kind of hard to come back to reality and have a conversation with someone concretely who has these different opinions.
Okay.
So I think it's very useful for me completely, just to see, the tensions between the two, and because this is how things get worked out, right? Like people need to have these conversations.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you're willing to have the conversation. And I know I kind of explained that to you beforehand. They're like, well, we might disagree on a bunch of stuff. So I'm really glad that you came on, and I'm glad we can have this conversation. I think it's valuable to me.
Sitting here as a middle class educated white woman, I feel like I don't have so much to lose as opposed to, having back to my example of a queer woman of color having to sit there and like defend their humanity. I feel like there's a bit of a buffer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to I hope I wouldn't offend their humanity, or try to diminish it, but maybe some of my views would just in their however they're manifested. But I wanted to get back to your idea, or anyway, I'll say something that you probably really will disagree with, which is probably everything I've said. But I actually don't really believe rights are real. And that's because something in my mind, something that can be taken away so easily isn't real if it's not a right. Like if you say we have a right to housing and then all of a sudden the economy collapses and we are living in a like economic state similar to sub-Saharan Africa, people can talk all about their rights to housing, but it just doesn't exist because nobody can afford it and houses aren't being built, right? We can talk about our right to free speech, which I think is like a fundamental value of our society. I think that's one of the most important things in, the West, is that people can freely express their opinions without fear of, government oppression. But it's not really a right because at any given time, I can't, somebody can stop me from doing it. So I think it's more, I like to look at things more like responsibilities. Like as a society, we have a responsibility to protect people who are speaking their mind. As a society, we have a responsibility to provide homes for people, but a responsibility is susceptible to failure, right? Like we can have a responsibility to provide homes for people and fail at that. Whereas if people have a right to homes, it almost sounds like it's like a necessity that it necessarily must be done, whereas it's not being done. Like, so how can it be a right if it's failing? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I kind of do. How I want to respond is that, human rights are breached all the time, all over the globe. That being said, when you kind of, think past, like I will use Indigenous communities as an example, where before colonizers came to this land, people were able to create their own shelters, right? Like you didn't have to go and register that and like buy a house, right? So anything that we were able to do to take care of ourselves, like got to this point in society, I would give as a human right. So the ability to like feed yourself, to shelter yourself, to have the knowledge, like at least the cultural knowledge and like cultural education, to heal yourself, like all these things we were able to do at any point in time without having to go through a bureaucracy or the government.
Yeah, I still don't really agree, because if you built yourself a shelter on Vancouver Island in the year 1200, it'd be reasonably likely that a group of Haida would just come and take it from you and take everything you have and take you as a slave, because, that's what they did. They were like, there's great and beautiful things about that culture, but like lots of First Nation tribes took slaves and they did raids, and like because they were so efficient at catching game, and there's just a very lush environment, right? You can go get mussels and stuff from the ocean. Like, so that person actually didn't have any appeals to that. They couldn't appeal and saying, well, this is actually crown land. They were just captured and tortured and used as a slave.
Was it crown land though? Like when we look at the origins of like treaties, and I mean, I'm not entirely.
Okay. What I mean is like right now, if you just went into the woods and set up your tent,
you can't do that. Tent City tried to do that in Goldstream Park. They tried to do it above Goldstream Park, and they were consistently just chased out because you can't technically camp there and whatnot.
There's lots of places in Canada that are considered crown land where you can put up a tent. I think the rule, and I might be wrong, but I believe the rule is that you can stay for 2 weeks on crown land, and then you have to move your site every 2 weeks. But there's plenty of like obscure places where you could way overstay your welcome. But when you overstay that welcome, you're not going to be raped and attacked. You're going to be like some bureaucrat is going to come there and say, you're going to have to leave. Now, if you don't, eventually you're going to be either thrown in jail or killed. Like unfortunately, that's like what the government does when you don't listen to them. But I would rather have that than, be alone in 1200 on Vancouver Island. I don't think it's necessarily, I'm not even saying it's necessarily better or worse, but it's just always been the case is that there's you don't have a right to set up a shelter on Vancouver Island anywhere because it can just be taken from you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is very true. Outside of my apartment complex, there is a sign on the park which has one bench and a bunch of trees, and it just says no sheltering.
Yeah.
What that small park is used for, besides my dog shitting in it, not too sure. But people aren't allowed to put shelters there. And I do think, obviously, rights. The concept of a right is a human invention.
Yeah. And I should backtrack. I think I was a little bit too. I do think it's good to have like some universal things in society that we all say, you know what, people should have. We should do our best to make sure people get these things. I think I'm kind of picking on that word and being a bit semantic there. But anyway, sorry, go on.
No, that is entirely correct because my understanding of it is if you were able to do these things before, I don't know, serfdom or wage labor, and it's
which like what kind of thing, like setting up a shelter?
Yeah.
But what place and time could you ever set up a shelter and just expect to be free from persecution?
Okay, depends on what type of persecution, because I mean, there's all sorts of type of persecution that
from having everything you own stolen and being taken into slavery.
Where exactly?
Like any place, any time. I mean,
I feel like this is getting like very abstract,
but that's kind of what I'm saying is that like we have a structure now and signs in this official ways that we don't let people just set up tents anywhere they want, but it's always been the case that people can't just set up where they want and expect that outside influence are going to interact with them.
Well, I mean, okay, so yes, there's always been threats to people's livelihoods, whether it is the police officer coming and taking down your tent, or whether it's a saber-toothed tiger coming and ripping apart your, or coming into your cave and eating you. But that being said, it's different to look at, I would say natural threats that are just part of living on Earth, as opposed to things that become like almost ridiculous, like taking down someone's tent because there's a sign there that says that you can't shelter when you're not really harming anybody. There's nothing really. And also there are pretty viable solutions.
I was talking about like specifically a human threat, like in the case of Vancouver Island where we're living, it'd be the Haida, like which had, raiding parties. And I'm not trying to condemn them because like
I just don't know enough about that culture to fully comment on. I
think like so in Europe there would be like warlords, like the Vikings would basically go take what you had, and like Africa, like all cultures had these like humanity's full of like blood and horror and like things that we can hardly even conceptualize unless you've been to some of these countries that still live and die by the sword. So yeah, that's kind of where it's like, to me, it's artificial to say that there was once this ability to just live and not be bothered by society or human beings, because I don't think it's really ever existed. Certainly not supported. Like if you just set up your tent and on Vancouver Island, nobody set up a little stick shelter. Nobody would feed you. Nobody would take care of you. You'd have to do whatever is required to nourish yourself and sustain yourself, and then hope that nobody found where you're living and took what you had.
Yeah, there's always, been an external threat due to lack of resources. This is like the one time I'm going to say God bless technology, not the one time, but God bless technology, because we are fortunate to have an abundance of resources, enough and more than enough to meet our needs, right? So, are there always going to be greedy people? I think I'm going to say yes, but I think
for sure, yeah,
it's also to a culture of extreme wealth hoarding that, we owe our current concept of greed. But let's go back to to Vikings and whatnot, right? Like it's either for land or it's for, I don't know, maybe land to rights to hunt on that land and whatnot. Either way, I'm not saying you're never going to be bothered by anybody. I'm just saying that people did have the ability to have a piece of land that they were able to set up their tent. I'm not saying the second, you set up your little tent, you set up your little shelter, no one can ever bother you because that's your right kind of thing. I'm just saying there was less obstacles to providing for yourself in that sense than there are currently. Does that kind of make sense?
I totally understand what you're saying. If I can paraphrase, it's basically that in the past, it was easier for the average human being to take ownership of a piece of land and take what they needed out of that land to provide for themselves in an abundant and their families in an abundant sort of way.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about 300 years ago where you couldn't own land if you were a woman. I'm talking about much farther in the past before these systems were developed and entrenched into our lifestyle.
Hunter-gatherer culture.
More so, honestly, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's hard to take it back that far because, we obviously don't have
we went
histories
way
of
off
those, but
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we should probably get back onto drugs where we, So, yeah, to kind of to bring it back, we talked about a lot of the obstacles to providing these services and my kind of BS and, what the financial problems are with having a theoretical non-limit. But to bring it back to kind of reality and where you've been working, what are some of the best programs that have been tried on a small scale and you're excited about being introduced at a larger scale, either locally or federally?
Oh, okay. Well, I think the most exciting would be clinics like Crosstown Clinic in Vancouver, it's just outside of Vancouver, that do prescription heroin for people. Because I think the solution, the antidote to the overdose crisis is providing a safe supply of drugs for people. So yeah, we both agree that drugs should be legalized. They should certainly be regulated because it's only with prohibition that they're adulterated. We had a glass of wine, but we don't have to worry about fentanyl being in that wine, right? I don't have to worry about my weed being weird when I buy it from a dispensary.
And even if you, fentanyl is so cheap that if fentanyl was legal, people would buy it from sources that had a reputation of, not killing people. So you'd still
there'd be a measured dose.
Yeah. You'd just like now when you take an aspirin, you take one aspirin, it's the power of one aspirin. You don't sometimes take an aspirin and have 10x your dose, and then sometimes it doesn't have an effect. These things are really well done because they have high-end precision machines, whereas when it's a baggie from China that comes up and is cut up by a bunch of, assholes that don't really care about their clientele and are just making a quick buck, then that's where we have all these problems. So I think that something like that I would go like 90% of to where you are. I think that these things should be totally legal and just let the free market decide the pricing in terms of like, I think that would actually drive the price so far below street value for some of the things like opioids, like fentanyl for one, that, you know, we wouldn't have the poverty issues that we do now associated with those. But.
No, certainly not. And I think, so, you know, there's this like kind of myth that people can't function well on heroin, but that's not true at all. I mean, you completely can. People were taking heroin, so like heroin, morphine derivatives, and going about their daily lives. Yeah. Like they still do today, but I mean in a large scale, like prescription kind of way, like 120 years ago.
My understanding of it is like, if somebody's addicted to heroin, it's almost better, if you were their employer, it's almost better to have them at work when they're on heroin than not. Because like, you know, at a certain point, if you become addicted and you're taking fairly large doses, a small dose of heroin actually brings you back to normal. And your body so adapts. That's why it's so addicting, right? Is your body adapts, and that becomes kind of your homeostasis, is like it needs the heroin just to function.
Yeah, and that's why withdrawal is so problematic. But there are people who are along their substance use path, I would say, like so deeply that they function and perform a lot better while on drugs. But that being said, going back to programs that I think are, you know, super
most
exciting.
helpful,
And I think being able to prescribe individuals what they need so they can, you know, you're spending all day worrying about being dope sick. You have to, like prohibition causes things like violence and like petty crimes and like property crimes, because like you need to steal in order to like get your fix, as opposed to.
You can't think long term. You just have to focus on.
You cannot. Like when you're trying just to survive, you don't have. Like the everyday isn't kind of a long term. It's just like, I need to get my next hit so I don't get dope sick, and that's it, right? As opposed to having a little pill bottle by your night table and just taking, you know, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. These programs have shown decrease in excessive substance use, and then other things that I just like I'm excited about and I wish I could see in like more of like a large scale would be safe consumption sites everywhere.
Yeah.
And
what does a safe consumption site look like? I've never been to one.
It's very like medically sterile looking, where there's just like this mirror and a light so you can see your vein.
Just like a single room. No, you can't. That's not social.
No, they're like stalls.
Okay.
So like, you know, you sit down at the chair and there's like, you know, like panels, and then like the next, because, you know, you can't sell in them, so you can't have like connection to the next person when you're using. But then they also have places like chill zones where people can go and hang out. Just, you know, they should stay there for about 10 to 15 minutes after they use to ensure they're not going to overdose when they leave. And like,
that's supervised to make sure people aren't using in that
area? Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can't use in that area. Okay. But a nurse will be there to attend to people. I think my personal issue with safe consumption sites is that they are too medical and people don't want to go to them.
It sounds awful, yeah.
It sounds really lame. Like I would much rather like shoot up in a friend's home than go and shoot up at
you and
some
me both.
like than go into this like kind of very like highly surveilled. And it's not the people who run safe consumption sites, from the people that I've met, are, you know, wonderful, and they're usually peers and people who have lived experience. So they're not, you know, mean and judgy, but at the same time, I've actually met people who are kind of crappy who work at safe consumption sites, and, you know, they're usually the people who got into it through healthcare or through like health administration and management.
Right.
And it makes for an unwelcoming environment. I mean, the point of drug use is, for a lot of people, I'm going to say pleasure, right? So if you're kind of taking that out of the equation.
Oh, do you think it's more pleasure or coping? Because like in my mind, those you wouldn't go to one of those safe sites if you're looking to like have fun. It's like you're going if you're trying to cope with your addiction.
But that does bring immediate like pleasure, right? Like you shoot up, you're like, okay, there we go. Like you're good now, kind of thing.
Okay.
And it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? Like
fair enough,
it makes sense that you cope with something that's positive and enjoyable for yourself.
Totally. Yeah, I see your point there.
Yeah, so kind of erasing that from the equation and making it so medical, I think, But that comes with this idea that like if it's too cool, people are going to want to go there all the time. But like,
yeah.
I don't think that's not really. I mean, like if safe consumption sites were bumping and they had like good music and food, like would you want to go there?
I know what you mean, and I totally agree if it was like a closed loop. But the problem is if it was too cool, it would attract people that wouldn't otherwise be using, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it should become like a bar.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm saying that it should just be a lot more comfortable as opposed to what I see now. But that has nothing to do with the individuals who set up these sites and whatnot.
Yeah, they're doing the best they can, probably.
Yeah, they're working within, the policy constraints. And the government fear that if this is an enjoyable place, people will want to come and do drugs there. So
what's the main, like what's getting in the way of doing these, like this program that you first mentioned where it's like prescribing, I think you used heroin as an example to people, and you basically have like your bottle of pills of heroin, and you just take them as you need. I guess the fear would be somebody would sell them, or B, do too much of them and then come back, and then I guess that's the fear, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it is. And they're sorry. That doesn't tend to be the case. People use them. And I mean, at this point, it's really...
And why not, actually? Like, why don't more people that are just... And maybe they have the early stages of drug use and are just looking to get high, why don't they sign up for these programs? It's okay. I can edit all that out.
Okay, because I'm dying.
Yeah. Give her hell. I'll edit it out.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, all good.
Why are people...
Oh, yeah. What I was saying is, how do they screen people out that are... like that aren't just looking to like abuse these programs? How do they make sure that they're not?
They're really quite regulated. This is for like at least at the Crosstown Clinic. My understanding is that it's only people who have been on methadone, Suboxone, and there's another one that I can never pronounce that starts with a B. And it doesn't work for them. Yeah. So they use this prescription heroin.
Right. So they've already been through a program where they're trying to get off.
Yeah.
Drugs, yeah.
It also, I mean, I'm saying in an ideal world, they get to take home their pills. It's not really how it works. I know for methadone that you have to show up there every single morning. Every morning you got to pee in a cup to show that you weren't on heroin, and then you get your methadone. So, I mean, obviously.
Because they're worried about people abusing methadone.
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't really happen. I mean, I think I've seen a very quick antidote of somebody... like they'll sell methadone, but I think that's less of an abuse to get high and more, I would say, like in a legal framework, an abuse because you're selling a substance that you're not supposed to be selling. But it's for people who have maybe used heroin but wouldn't get their methadone dose because they've used heroin but still need the methadone to maintain that continuum of getting off of drugs. Yeah, people slip up, right? So yeah, I think that is a little overregulated and unfair. I don't think you should deny treatment to somebody. I mean, someone had once said that drug addiction is the only disease, and I say disease with little finger quotes because I personally don't think it's a disease. I think it's like a social response, but it's the only disease that you punish people for showing symptoms of. So you don't get your methadone if you use heroin, but what are you trying to do with the methadone? It's to get people off of heroin, right? And drug use is kind of like, it's a really entrenched habit into somebody. So punishing them for acting on that is, really problematic. And I think it's more value laden than it is an actual healthcare response. Yeah.
I mean, that's where you and I completely agree. I don't understand why. I mean, I understand why based on the history that drugs are illegal. And I still think there's a lot of things in our society that are kind of like that. Like people feel uncomfortable or feel some sort of like mother complex to protect other people from things they think are wrong. Or I don't even know if it's like even something like gay marriage, for example. Like, I do not understand why anybody has a problem with gay marriage.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
It's like, it'd be one thing if they were coming into your house and forcing you to gay marry them, but I've never heard of that. Like, I've never heard of like roving bands of homosexuals that force you to marry them. If that was the case, then I would be against gay marriage. I don't want, but that's not the case. It's like, it's a strange thing where it's like, well, that, I don't like that, so you shouldn't be allowed to do it. And I think the same thing is for drugs. Like, it's like, even if you disagree with it, like, you're given one life, that person's given their life, they're making decisions, and who are you to get in the way of that?
I think people exaggerate the harms of drugs. Most people who use drugs don't become addicted to them, right? I mean, like, there are plenty of people every single day who use, I don't know, a range of
illegal
drugs.
Or legal drugs. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're not addicted to it. So the idea of being like, you can't use drugs. And if you use heroin, you don't get methadone because you're still doing this behavior. We're not going to give you clean syringes because we're enabling you. It's a really fundamental misunderstanding of addiction and drug use itself.
Yeah.
And it comes from these old age narratives of the just say no, and drug use is associated with like a morally decrepit population, whether it be people of color or whether it be people who are anti-war, or the phrase dirty hippies is a real phrase. And I thought that
they really are dirty.
No, I mean, I thought that way about ravers for so long. I was like, oh, gross, sweaty ravers. Like, they look checked out. And these are all these internalized messages that I've been getting. And it wasn't until exposing myself to these people like regularly and not just kind of knowing about them in a lore kind of sense that I realized that there is absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to alter your conscience. Okay, yeah, you get sweaty. I get sweaty when I drink. So, you know what I mean? Like, I kind of, it was over exaggerating the characteristics and the harms associated with this particular drug use that I just picked up from popular culture without really critically thinking about where it came from.
Well, alcohol is one of the most harmful and addicting drugs out there, right?
It is hands down the most harmful drug.
I think it's the only one, like one of the only like substances of abuse that you can die from withdrawal, right?
I've heard that, yes. But it's harmful in so many other ways too. Just like I think I saw a recent statistic that more people still die of alcohol related illnesses than people who die of overdoses in Canada yearly on average.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Although maybe the fentanyl overdose crisis is quite extreme.
No, still.
Even still.
Oh yeah. No, I think there was last year 4,500 almost.
Is it alcohol-related deaths?
Like heart disease and that kind of stuff.
Like drunk driving and all that stuff taken into account.
I think also,
It's not just people choking on their vomit. That's like the kind of typical
or
alcohol-induced death, right?
Yeah. But, also the substance itself isn't very harmful. Like our example of meth, I mean, people take that daily, right? Like people take amphetamines every day to study.
So what is this like, I don't actually know, like when you see people with like meth scabs, like is that what does that mean? Is that, like I've heard of that, like crystal meth. I don't know if that's just like a stereotype, but I mean, you definitely see it. Like you don't have to walk far in downtown Victoria to see people like that. But
there are tons of other illnesses that are related to poverty. So people say like, meth equals really bad teeth, right? Actually doing methamphetamine has like zero impact on your teeth. It's just that
poverty's bad for your teeth.
Poverty's bad for your teeth. And people who are addicted to meth tend to be impoverished.
Right.
And
the people that aren't impoverished and addicted to amphetamines
have great teeth.
Probably have great teeth and fair enough.
Very
and you don't know
true.
They're addicted to amphetamines.
Exactly, right? So people act like if you're, on meth, people can totally tell and you're just this weird like tweaking and like, well, that happens. I mean, I've also seen people take a lot of Dexedrine and act kind of weird as well, right? And that, like, not to say that that's like problematic, but I'm saying like talking fast and being like erratic and those kind of things that we assume I think depending on how the individual looks, like if you have bad teeth and like scabs on your face from, again, probably living in poverty, you see that and you're just like, oh, meth, tweaking, as opposed to friends of mine who have been on like Dexedrine and talking really, really quickly, and you just kind of think maybe that they're just like this. So there's this other visual, I would say, factors that like kind of build off of these preconceived notions of a meth head or other types of drug users that influence how we perceive them depending on their social location.
Yeah. Okay. And so what kind of things do you think the average person could do? And actually, I'll split this into two parts. Like, what perceptions should the average person change about the homeless and these people in this cycle of addiction? Like, what would be like, if you could kind of sum it up, how do you think people look at that problem incorrectly?
I think people see it as an individual problem when it's not. I mean, again, I feel like I haven't done a very good job of articulating it, so maybe I'll try to sum it up now. But there's a lot of factors that play a role in someone's life that you, depending on who you are, aren't aware of, right? So, like, you may live a very sheltered life and have no idea how certain things come into play to create homelessness or drug addiction or poverty. Yeah. And I think people also need to educate themselves on the origin of drug laws to see, well, I mean, I think school should do this, but basically to see how drug laws aren't based on pharmacological or social harms. They're based on racist perceptions of individuals who were using these substances as much as white people were, but you go after people who have less resources when you want to make something illegal, right? Like, you're not going to go after people who can like actually fight that law because, well, why would you bother then? And then and
it just like, one thing that I think like a lot of conservatives would agree, as well as liberals, is like, if you make something that everybody does illegal, now all of a sudden you can arrest whoever you want.
Yes and no, but you can arrest.
Well, that's kind of what I mean. Is like let's just say you made teeth brushing illegal. It's like, well, now you can arrest any black person because they brush their teeth.
Oh yes, that's entirely.
So you can you can do any racist thing you want or any prejudice thing you want. So now that's something like, I have concerned about when they try to make something that is like genuinely done by the population, generally done illegal. Like speeding, for example. I have a problem with that. It's like, generally people drive 10 kilometers over the speed limit, but you don't get arrested if you drive 10 over. But it gives the discretion of the police officer
decide who he wants to arrest.
He can just arrest whoever he wants.
Yeah, entirely.
And
yes,
that's crazy to me. It should be set at a reasonable thing, and if you're going 1 or 2 over, then you should be like pulled over. Like, I mean, not that everybody should be pulled over, but it's like we should have the speed limit set at such a speed such that like it's silly to go over it, and that I don't think this is good now that people kind of have to use their personal judgment of how far over the speed limit, because everybody is susceptible to arrest. Now that's a pretty minor thing, all things considered, but that's kind of like what I'm getting at, is if smoking marijuana is illegal, now the government has the power to arrest anybody. And I think that's kind of like basically what you had summed up earlier, is when you said they had these populations like Vietnam War protesters that they wanted to, you can't make protesting illegal. It's a lot harder to, but if they're all smoking pot, then you can make that illegal and arrest whoever you want. Yeah. So I definitely agree with like restricting the government's power to like exercise non-discretionary violence.
Against people's bodily autonomy. Also, I mean, cannabis, I think it was like 1969 where they lessened the sentence because so many white people were trying cannabis that they were like, oh crap, like we can't make this illegal because, or like if we keep up with our harsh like penalties for this, then we're going to have to jail a lot of white people. We can't do that, right? Like that. And that's why
that's where I think we have a difference in like how we perceive how government works.
No, that's genuinely what they did. Like, it's well documented that because of the increasing rates of white people going to prison. I mean, this is 1969. You could be a lot more overtly racist at this point. But yeah, so they lightened up the sentence so people weren't going to jail. I swear, I pinky promise. Facts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I struggle to I hope that it wasn't in those same terms, but if you're right, that's pretty terrible.
Yeah.
And so like kind of the second part of the question first was like, how people should change their perspectives or how they could change their perspective. What do you think people could do, whether it's lobbying for these programs to be changed, voting, or actually volunteering, like kind of the stuff you do? Like, what do you think is the most impactful thing that a citizen could do to help out these people that are, in these, cycles of abuse, or just, pushed to the side by the system?
I think recognizing their inherent humanity and treating them with dignity is like probably the most meaningful thing.
Okay.
I think talking to other people about, like, if you've learned anything from this, to talk to people about what you've learned. Other than that, I'd love to say, like, you should volunteer, but at the same time, like, if you hold really harmful beliefs, I don't think you should be around that population, just as an act of violence towards them. But
you think people would be like really offended by the things that I talk about? Like, do you think, having this conversation, do you think if certain people in this community heard me speaking, would it anger them to think, like, when I talk about these kind of like ideas of personal responsibility and limited economic availability?
I'm going to say yes and no. I feel like a lot of people tend to beat themselves up for where they like end up in life. But at the same time, I know plenty of them, and you can't talk about like people who use substances, I mean, homeless people as like a homogenous population.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
I think they would think that you are quite ignorant of the realities of the forces that play in their life. I'm sure some people would be ragefully angry, but I think most would recognize that as a misunderstanding of kind of what people in their position in the world endure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I mean, that's where we kind of we agree as well. Because like generally, when I talk to people who are at this like, at least perceptively like this like pretty low state, they do take a lot of personal responsibility for that, and I think I actually think that's a good thing, even though if it's harmful at the time, it's like personal responsibility is the way that they're going to get out, even if it's through a program like, applying for this like thing that you mentioned. What was it? It was like basically getting, your heroin as a prescription.
Oh, yes.
That takes some personal responsibility on that human being. Like as a society, if we accept like limited resources, we can't go find every single person that's like buying heroin off a dealer and has all these problems. Like, hey, we'll just give this to you for free. Like, we don't have the resources available to hire people to do that. At some point, it has to be left to the individual to say like, hey, man, like, come on, we have this program set up. And I guess like that kind of conduits to my last question, like what advice would you give to somebody who is in an addictive cycle, whether they're homeless or not? What are the best resources that person can utilize to help, break themselves out of that cycle?
I would say, just to answer this question, the most important thing is, keeping yourself alive. So using harm reduction sites. That being said, though, like you said that we don't have like the money to be able to go and do this. I mean, outreach workers are a huge core to, and I mean, that's kind of like where, like a core to harm reduction social movement, because you want to literally meet people where they're at. Right. And when you're spending literally all day, like these people live in a cultural periphery almost. Like sometimes you can be so removed from the daily happenings of what the rest of the world is because your street life is so much more different than, someone who doesn't have that. It's kind of like, it's hard to reintegrate into that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've heard this one thing about, like depression and like desperation in general, in that your time horizon shrinks. So if you're not depressed and very healthy, you can plan in the future 20 years. Like you say, oh, maybe here, like that's somebody that's extremely doing well, so they can think and set up for retirement to this stuff. But as you get more and more desperate, your ability to project into the future shrinks to the point where if you're at say you're suffering from horrifying, debilitating PTSD, you can look about 30 seconds into the future. Like you're just trying to get through the next 30 seconds. So I can imagine like kind of what you're saying is that these people on the street who have this like systemic oppression and, that they can't project so far into the future, that it's hard for them to actually go and seek out these programs, which might, see a benefit in 2 to 3 weeks. They just want to, well, like you said, they just kind of trying to stay alive.
And it's not even that, but like it takes resources to find resources, right? So you already have to have the ability to access a computer or know where these sites are to go there, to go find more resources, right? Like you can throw pamphlets as much as you want.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I understand the difficulty of not wanting to go to these places just because of how poorly people have been treated. Stigma is actually one of the biggest barriers of accessing these services, because we would love to believe that the people providing these services don't have harmful, views of people in this situation. But like, unfortunately, that is not true.
Right.
And a lot of people, when you're already in such a vulnerable state, 1 negative experience, 2 negative, 3 negative experiences, like that's kind of enough to keep you away from wanting to go back somewhere. Even if you think like, okay, well, I talked to this person just to get through it so I can get to this program. Like you're also looking at this situation being like, okay, I just have to go dehumanize myself like for a little bit and then, it'll be fine. And that's a really hard thing to do when you're constantly beaten down.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Absolutely. Yeah. So, is there anything else you wanted to mention about harm reduction and, your work in this field?
I do want to say that everybody should get trained in naloxone. On Vancouver Island in Victoria, there are almost regular kind of group events. Like if you go to UVic, you can do it at the Wellness Center. Kool-Aid offers training sessions. I believe AIDS Vancouver Island also offers training sessions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that training through the fire hall, the naloxone training. But one thing actually, so there's lots of AEDs everywhere, and you can look at maps where various AEDs are stored in a building.
What are those AEDs?
Oh, automatic electronic defibrillator. So it's restart your heart. So those things are pretty easy to use because as soon as you turn them on, they actually have like verbal commands. It'll say like step away, and then like grab left paddle, place it like they're nice that way. But with these kits, like if I were on the street and I saw somebody overdosing, I have the training to do that. But if I don't have, like, what would you do if I just saw somebody overdose lying in the street? What would be your next step?
I mean, I carry an naloxone kit in my backpack.
So that's a good measure. You just do that.
First of all, yeah. Like I'm someone who would, like, I see people who are passed out and if I can't see the color of their face, I give them a gentle little nudge. I'm like, hey, and they're just like, oh, fine. I'm like, okay, good. And then I move on with my life. But if they're not nudging and you see their face is purple.
Yeah.
I mean, in BC, we don't have the intranasal sprays. We have the actual syringes. And like, I personally find them super easy to use. You just have to make sure all the liquid is in the bottom part of the vial. You flick that little bit off and then you kind of suction the liquid in and then just stab them. I also have an EpiPen who I've had to like administer to myself personally. So I feel like I'm a little bit more equipped in that sense. Yeah.
I think like most people with an hour of training can
not
deliver.
It's like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You just have to carry it on you. That's the thing. Like, and sometimes.
That was, I guess what you're saying is not to try to take the training and then find a random one and hope that there's a public one available. It's like take the training and carry it.
Yes, definitely take the training, carry it. And it's important too to be able to display it somewhere visible. So I keep mine on the side of my backpack in case there is an overdose. Someone can approach me to be like, hey, there's someone overdosing back in this alley, right? And then I would go there as opposed to like it's just in my backpack and no one knows about it. And then I kind of just expect to stumble upon an overdose, which I mean obviously happens, but you want it visible and also easily accessible.
And I mean, if you didn't have an naloxone kit, but you knew how to deliver it, would it be reasonable to search the person to see if they had one? Do a lot of these people carry a kit if they're using drugs? Is that common?
Oh my God. Yeah. The people, like I find people who use drugs to be the most like responsible people when it comes to naloxone. I mean, we're at a point in this crisis now where so many people have lost a lot of their friends and family that you just don't want to risk it. Right. It's, unfortunately very fear motivated, but, something that I find like, and that's what I like, that is a level of personal responsibility for sure that people have like in fear of. You're not going to stop using because your life circumstances haven't changed. However, at least you can make sure that you're not going to die or your friend
Yeah.
isn't going to die. I mean, they're quite big, so I feel like if they had it would be visible.
Yeah, it's about the size of like a old like a remote control. Like
Yeah.
a kit. And like I think the ones I've seen are blue and they have like a cross on them usually.
Yeah, no, they're about the size of like TV remote. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a great message for people. Take the training, buy an naloxone kit.
No, it's free. You don't have to buy it.
Oh, you don't have to buy it.
You literally just go up to the pharmacy, and unfortunately, they still make you do the 15-minute wait because they do charge it to the government.
Okay.
But yeah, it's entirely free. You can ask the pharmacist how to administer it. I don't think all pharmacists are like well trained and to be able to give it to give that training like on the spot. But they know
worst
enough.
case, you can find a video on YouTube or whatever, and
yeah, I mean it's
pretty
super,
straightforward.
Yeah, for sure.
Very cool. Okay. And I know you have a Twitter handle.
Yeah. So if you're interested in anything that I have said and want to know more about this, I do tweet about this at LILBBYACEDMIC.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate you coming on. Sorry that it turned into more of a discussion rather than just me learning from you, but I hope that people will take something out of this.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. I hope you guys enjoyed the back and forth with Stephanie. I'm really curious to hear feedback on this one. Stephanie and I, we differ so much ideologically. I had trouble getting down to the substance of her knowledge in homelessness and addiction. I think I was focused too much as an interviewer on where we differed and not in getting to the specific experiences of the people that she's dealt with in these at-risk populations. So anyway, yeah, I'm curious to hear if you liked that back and forth, if you liked that critical analysis of where she was coming from, or if you would prefer that if I kind of just ignored those differences and focused on extracting, the kind of substance of Stephanie's knowledge in this field. I want to continue to bring on experts and really try to get information out of them and help, myself and you guys as the audience learn from people that are particularly knowledgeable in an area such as drug use and homelessness. So let me know what you thought of our podcast there. Hit me up on Twitter or email. Email is contrapodcast@gmail.com. And my Twitter is @contra_podcast. Thanks so much for listening.